Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum going home. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Ethereum, in my opinion, is in the process of heading home. And in this case, for purposes of home, it is defined as the lower logarithmic regression trend line. So there is a lower logarithmic regression trend line that Ethereum has gone to basically every single cycle. Now, there are a lot of people that would say that this regression trend line simply needs to be refit, and potentially there is validity to that assessment. However, the other side of it is that that process is still ahead of us, and I think it's going to play out in this quarter of this year. So Q4 of 2024, I do think Ethereum will finally go home, and I want to use this video to talk about the reasons why. And with that said, I still think you could argue it is worthwhile to hedge, especially with the ETH Bitcoin valuation between 0.03 to 0.04. But with that said, the whole process has been playing out. And I know it's been a long one. And frankly, I know a lot of people have given up on the idea. But I still think there is reason to believe that this is the most likely outcome. So, one of the things that we follow very closely on this channel is not the ETH USD valuation. And the reason for that is it makes absolutely no sense to value a cryptocurrency on its USD pair when you should be valuing it on its Bitcoin pair. The USD pair, the asset should trend higher over a long enough period of time because the reference point is the US dollar, which is asymptotically going to zero. Therefore, it is more prudent to value other cryptocurrencies on their Bitcoin pairs because Bitcoin, in my opinion, is lower risk than all the other cryptocurrencies. So the Bitcoin valuation of the cryptocurrency market is the only thing that actually matters. Now, 2 years ago, I imagine that might not have made a lot of sense to people who joined the cryptoverse in 2021. But as you stand here today and you look at what has become of the ETH Bitcoin valuation, you should be able to now understand where I am coming from. Okay? So, the thing to think about with Ethereum is that there have been two times in history where the ETH Bitcoin valuation has broken down. And I know a lot of you guys have heard this narrative before, but there's going to be some new people that maybe haven't heard this view of the market and they're just deciding to check in because they're wondering what's going on, right? Why is the market not trending up in Q4 like they were promised across most of the other parts of the cryptoverse by other people, right? This has been this idea that the merge would save it, that the deflationary aspect would save it, that that the ETF would save it, and ETH Bitcoin just keeps on dropping, and ETH USD keeps on dropping. And what I've been trying to communicate is that none of that stuff matters during tightening cycles and during all these rate hikes and also quantitative tightening. Now, I'm not saying that the arguments that people have presented are invalid. It's just that they don't matter at this stage of the cycle. They will probably start to matter in 2025, just as everyone probably gave up on it, or just as everyone probably gives up on it. So, what we need to look at is what happened by Ethereum in 2016 and in 2019 and now in 2024. I have been given a lot of grief for this view, but again, it has played out. And if all it took was patience for ETH Bitcoin to go to 0.03 to 0.04, if all it took was patience for Bitcoin dominance to hit that 60% milestone, and it's possible it goes higher, is it not true? Is it not possible that all it takes is patience this cycle to see these milestones play out. So what happened in 2016 and 2019 with the ETH Bitcoin valuation? You essentially had two tops that occurred, and what I'd like to do is actually try to draw this out a little bit, make circles so that we can see this pattern a little bit more clearly, right? So the first thing you can see is that in each of these cycles, whether you're looking at 2016, 2019, or 2024, you will notice that there are two peaks that formed, right? And it was in those two peaks that it was that lower high that occurred was the warning that the rest was going to play out. And this is what we've been talking about on this channel since 2021, and it took a long time, and frankly people just didn't believe it, and they fought tooth and nail. But as you know, once again, monetary policy has ultimately prevailed. So you essentially get these two peaks that occur, and in the middle of those two peaks, right, sometime in the middle of those two peaks, the market, ETH Bitcoin, sets this low. Now, that low at the time isn't so important because right after it, the market rallies up, making people think that Ethereum is going to go on and keep on going up and potentially flip Bitcoin, is the argument that people make. But the issue is that the low that is set is just telling you what the future support zone will try to be, even though it will eventually break down. And so this pattern has now happened 3 times. Now, there is a termination of this pattern that occurs eventually before ETH Bitcoin starts to durably go up. Now, I contend that ETH Bitcoin will start to go up not until 2025 durably. It could bottom before then, but I don't really think it's going to move higher in any sustainable manner until 2025. Now, that doesn't mean it can't get a nice bounce between now and then. In fact, I would argue it probably will get a nice bounce sometime between now and then. But this is the pattern that ETH Bitcoin has carried out in 2016, 2019, and 2024. And if you look at when ETH Bitcoin really durably broke down in 2016, you know, it had a fake out in the summer, and then it went down again in Q4. In 2019, it just broke through in the summer, and this cycle, it sort of had a fake out in April, and then it really broke down in July. So every single cycle has been slightly different, but the same thing has occurred on the ETH USD pair in both of these two cycles. And my argument, whether you agree with it or not, right, is irrelevant because there's a chance I am wrong. And I get things wrong a lot, right? But my argument, for anyone who cares to listen, is that in 2016, when, you know, a year that ETH Bitcoin broke down, Ethereum dropped about 70% from that top. In 2019, it dropped about 70% from that top. And that's excluding the pandemic-induced recession, right? It's excluding that. And then finally, we have this cycle, at which point ETH has already dropped about 52%. Now, my contention here is that in years where ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETH USD historically has gone down in the fourth quarter of the year, when it seemed like it should be going up to a lot of people. And we actually have two examples that are actually very different from one another. In 2019, ETH was going down in Q4 with Bitcoin. And that made a little bit more sense, right? I mean, Bitcoin was going down, so of course, you know, other cryptocurrencies would likely go down with it. In 2016, though, ETH was going down while Bitcoin was going up. So this is why I've been much more vocal about my views regarding Ethereum, because it just seems like it can't catch a break in years where ETH Bitcoin breaks down, right? Whether Bitcoin goes up or Bitcoin goes down in Q4, as these two examples show, Ethereum went down either way. And so that is my argument. And I do still think there is a good chance we will see Ethereum break down one more time without, right? And that's excluding a recession, right? I don't think that a recession matters at all for this outlook. Some people say you have to have a recession for Ethereum to go back down there. I would frankly disagree. You might have a scare, but I don't actually think you need one for Ethereum to go back down there. And to the critics that would fight back against that idea, put it this way. The S&P has done pretty well all year long, and it didn't stop Ethereum from dropping from $4,000 to 1,900. So why all of a sudden would another drop require a recession, right? Again, you could get one, but my argument is that you don't really need one for this to play out. In the same way, if you guys go back to my videos that I posted earlier this year, I said over and over and over again that my views on ETH Bitcoin were not dependent on the ETF at all, right? It was not dependent on the ETF. And sure enough, when the ETF was launched, ETH had a rally. And then a lot of people came out and said, I was wrong, right? Because the ETF came out and surely ETH was going to go put in new all-time highs. But when you look closely, 2024 has been almost a carbon copy of 2016 in terms of what happened since March. Because in March of 2016, ETH put in a high. And then it also put in another high in June. But if we ignore the wick, right, if we just sort of look at the candle bodies, you can see that was mostly a double top, just like it was in 2016. You had a top in March, and then you had a top in June. And the top in June, I remember vividly, right, in 2016, it felt back then, like it felt like that the market was just going to explode higher. And what ended up happening was the exact opposite. ETH bled back down, and then in Q4, when Bitcoin was screaming upwards, Ethereum dropped. And in 2019, when Bitcoin was dropping, Ethereum dropped in Q4 of the year. And so my contention is, what if history repeats itself again? Because you may be interested to know that even the capitulations in 2016 are timed basically identically with 2024. You had a capitulation in April, and you had one in August. In 2024, we had a capitulation in April and another one in August. And if you connect the dots here, you can kind of see that those line up. And if you were to connect the dots over here, if Ethereum does come home in December, it would essentially just be connecting the dots. One more drop in December, as measured from the high, that would be a drop of approximately 70%, which is exactly what happened in 2019, and it's exactly what happened in 2016. And so what my argument is that ETH will drop in November and December collectively, and then start to go back up in 2025. That is what I think is the most likely outcome. Now, I could be wrong, and I do think it makes sense to hedge in case I am wrong. I haven't thought it made sense to hedge in prior quarters. This is the first quarter where I've really started to think it makes sense to hedge. But the reason I think it makes sense to hedge now and not 2 years ago and 1 year ago is because ETH Bitcoin now is at what I would consider to be a fair valuation. Now, a lot of Bitcoin maxis would say that it's just going to go to zero, and a lot of ETH maxis would have told you it was never going to go this low. But my argument is it's just doing the same thing it's always done. And people just weren't willing to believe that monetary policy could possibly play a role. In fact, if you look at sort of longer term trend lines, perhaps on a linear scale, if we connect these lows, it almost looks eerie how similar it might end up being. Please understand that I'm not telling you this because I'm trying to induce fear or because anything like that, right? The reality is if most people just DCA'd this stuff and forgot about it and just didn't even listen to people like me, they probably would be better off than buying and selling Ethereum based on, opinions coming from people on YouTube. That's the reality, right? You probably would be better off to just come up with a DCA strategy and stick to it rather than trying to time anything based on what I'm saying. But I would be remiss to not point out that this process that was so hated and that I talked about over and over and over again for the last several years, it was always true. There was just people that were willing to believe it and people that were willing to not believe it. And now my concern is that the same thing is happening for Ethereum, and there's people willing to believe it and there's people that are not. And the reality is that, of course, you're going to always have the people that just scream up only. They're always going to be there, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with them. Over the long haul, it's better to be a perma bull than it is to be a perma bear, right? Markets generally trend up. So if you're going to pick one, you're probably better off being a perma bull over a long period of time than a perma bear, because markets generally trend higher. But the issue is that the same people that told you to buy the dip at, at 3,500 and at 3,000 and at 2,700 and at 2,500, right? They'll always just say the same thing, right? I mean, even though they scoff at my views and say that it'll never go down there, if it does go down there, they'll pretend like they never said it, right? And they'll just say buy the dip again. And of course, eventually they'll be right, just like eventually they'll probably be right when ETH Bitcoin bottoms. And I don't know when ETH Bitcoin's going to bottom. As a brief segue, I would say, as I've said previously, that when it takes out the 50-day SMA, the low is probably in. Because in 2016 and in 2019, when ETH Bitcoin took out its 50-day SMA after durably breaking down, the low was in. And you can see over here, just to sort of complete it, you can see in 2016, once it took out the 50-day moving average, the low was actually in after durably breaking down. So I would argue that whenever that's taken out, the low is very, very likely in. Just to tell you what that number is now, although you should look it up on a daily basis because it changes on a daily basis because it's a 50-day moving average. But just in case you're curious where that 50-day SMA is right now, it currently corresponds to about 0.03888. So if you see ETH Bitcoin back at 0.039 on daily closes, right? Not just a wick, because we even had a wick over here, but I was clear, it needs to be a daily close. If you see it back above 0.039 on daily closes, maybe two, then there's a good chance that the low is actually in. Until that time comes to pass, it's always possible that ETH Bitcoin could go lower, and I've been saying that for a while, and I mean, you can see that it just continues to slowly go lower, okay? So I still look at charts like this and wonder, if you're curious about, why was Bitcoin able to go to new all-time highs and ETH was not, I think the argument is, Bitcoin went to its lower logarithmic regression trend line. And so my argument is just simply that Ethereum needs to go home so that it can go back up, right? I'm not against Ethereum. It's just a process that I think needs to play out before the market can really be healthy again for Ethereum. And I know there's critics, but if you think about it, right? If you think about it, to all the critics out there, to every one of them that said I was wrong about ETH Bitcoin, and every one of them that said I was wrong about Bitcoin dominance, where are they now, right? Because it has been working, it has been playing out, and I look at charts like this, and I think it very well could be the missing piece that Ethereum goes down. Now, you saw me compare it to 2016. If you compare it to 2019, you'll also see a similarity. In 2019, after ETH USD fell below the bull market support band, in October and November of 2019, which is arguably where we are right now, right? October and November of 2024. Now, you might say, well, Ben, this is a halving year, right? This isn't 2019. This isn't a pre-halving year. It's a halving year. And you're right, it is. And that's why we made the comparison to 2016, right? We made the comparison to a halving year. So get off my back for that. But the reason 2019 comparison makes sense is because if you look at monetary policy, if you look at interest rates, this is what happened, right? Ethereum formed a wedge. It formed a wedge. It broke out of the wedge, and then it came back down, and then it bled down into Q4. Now look at it this cycle. You can see the same thing. There's a wedge that formed, and we talked about this 6 months ago. I said it's likely going to fall back into the wedge around the time of rate cuts, and it did, right? You can see the Fed cut rates in 2019. ETH fell into the wedge. Here, the Fed cut rates in 2024, and as that happened, ETH fell into its wedge. But then eventually, it broke down, and it went home. And I think that's what is about to happen in November and December of 2024. And if you look at the wedge really closely, it's eerily similar, because the lows that were set in 2024 and sort of leading into it are 10x the lows that were set in 2019. If we were to put a price label on the lows that Ethereum put in 2019, about $80, and then 100, and then where was this next one? Right around, 1,400. I believe that wick right there. Yeah, around 150. Sorry, what did I say? 1,400. Around 150. And then when it bled back down, back into the wedge, it bottomed at around 192. And then eventually it broke down and went to 152. Now, remember those 5 numbers, right? 80, 100, 150, 190. 80, 50, 100, 190. Look at this cycle. 800, 1,000, 1,500, and then this low here, 1,900. Isn't this just 10x these lows? Which, if it is, does that mean Ethereum is going to break down to 1,500 in the next few weeks? I think it's likely. Now, again, these videos aren't popular, and I'm sure I'll get destroyed on Twitter once again for posting this stuff. But I would implore you to every critic out there, right? I would implore you to every critic out there who will tear this stuff up, look back in March when I said, when ETH Bitcoin was starting to break down, it was sort of a fake out in April, and then it really went down a little bit a couple months later. Look back to what they said back then, because I highly doubt they would have said ETH would be at 2,400 by November. I think most of them were promising new all-time highs by this point. So I'm not asking you to believe the view has to come true, because I amongst all people, will tell you there is a good chance I'm wrong. There is a really good chance I'm wrong, and that's something that I think comes with just experiencing the markets for many, many years and being wrong a decent amount, right? There's a good chance I'm wrong. But I think it would also be unfair to say that the case I present is negligible, right? I think it would be unfair, because I still think there's overwhelming evidence that it could happen, right? I think the evidence is in these ideas I presented that have always felt to a lot of people like they were invalid and not coming true. But then they came true, right? Bitcoin dominance did go to 60%, even though they said it wouldn't, right? It did. And here we are. And now the argument isn't, is it going to go to 60? Now the argument is, where does it actually top? And I don't know exactly where it tops. It could go higher than 60. And the only way that it's not going to go higher than 60, in my opinion, is if ETH Bitcoin bounces. Because I think alt Bitcoin pairs still have further down to go, right? I think alt Bitcoin pairs right now, I mean, right now they're at 0.35, but the historical record says they bottom at 0.25. So alt Bitcoin pairs still likely have a drop ahead of them, and that's going to be a tailwind for things like Bitcoin dominance. So the only way that Bitcoin dominance doesn't go a lot higher is if ETH Bitcoin bounces. And I don't know how likely that scenario is. I've tried to look at this stuff and figure out, okay, could it find a low and alt Bitcoin pairs still bleed? It's a possibility, which is why I would always say that 60% was always going to be the minimum target. And I even put out a post on ITC Premium about 1 year ago, in fact, where I said, What keeps me up at night. It's not about, and this was when dominance was at 52%. And what I said was, it's not dominance never reaching 60, because I was so convinced that it would. What kept me up at night was dominance getting to 60 and then wondering what happens, right? Because there's still a chance that it continues to go up. Um, and honestly, what seems like the most likely outcome right now is that it turns around, but in 2025, right? That doesn't mean you can't see it come back down and consolidate or something. Maybe it does something like that or something. But I don't really think it's going to start moving down again until 2025. The problem with that for altcoins is that's still 2 months away. And the other problem for altcoins is that if you connect the dots on alt Bitcoin pairs last cycle, you can see that there's a very compelling similarity this cycle, where you tag this trend line the first time just sort of as the bear market begins. You tag the trend line the second time as the Fed, just before the Fed reaches the terminal rate in 2018 and here in 2023. And then you tag the trend line for the third time as the Fed is cutting interest rates. And it just seems like it's doing the exact same thing again, which is why I would argue that Ethereum going home is very bad news for altcoins, because they are still almost 30% off of their historical lows. So this is alt Bitcoin pairs. I'm not even talking about alt USD pairs. I'm talking about alt Bitcoin pairs are 30% off their lows. And I've been presenting this argument for the last 3 years, and everyone laughs at it, or a lot of people, maybe not everyone, it's not fair. A lot of people laugh at it. And I look back today and say, today, November 2nd of 2024, alt Bitcoin pairs are putting in a new low once again for the cycle. Therefore, every bearish video I've made on alt Bitcoin pairs over the last 3 years was valid and correct. And the people that laughed at them, where are they now, right? I mean, alt Bitcoin pairs just keep on going lower. And others Bitcoin, something I have said over and over and over again, was still in a bear market, right? If you look at others divided by Bitcoin, this is what was thrown in my face earlier this year as to why Bitcoin dominance views were wrong. You can see that the rally that occurred by others against Bitcoin in late 2023, it was just a bear market rally that eventually led to new lows. So you can see that these views I've presented were correct. The altcoin reckoning never actually ended. I just think people's patience to watch it play out is what ended. And then they turned against me because they thought there was no way it could go on this long in the cycle. But I'm telling you, the Cryptoverse has a cycle. It plays out every cycle. The process plays out every cycle. And there are those who are willing to watch it play out, and there are those who are not willing to, and they're willing to constantly say that this time is different. But when I look at the cycle, I see Ethereum at 2,400, and I just think that there is a really high probability that within a couple of months, probably in less than 2 months, we will look back at this and see that Ethereum finally went home. And it took until Q4 of 2024 to do so. I think it's almost there. In 2016, you can see that Ethereum finally entered the lower logarithmic regression trend line in basically early to mid-November. In 2019, it entered it in August, but then it got back above it and then didn't really durably stay in it until almost October, late September and October. This time, it tagged it back in August, kind of like it did in 2019, right? If you look at 2019, it went down in August, right? You can see it went down. It tagged it in August there as well, got a little bit of a rally, and I think it's about to get that drop. Do you remember earlier when I was showing you how Ethereum in 2019 basically just kept getting rejected from the 21-week EMA? You see that? You see all these wicks by ETH rejected right at the 21-week EMA. They couldn't even make it to the 20-week SMA, right? You see that? How ETH didn't even have the strength to get to the 20-week moving average. every single wick was a rejection at the 21-week EMA, and it actually continued until the first week of November, and it wasn't until the second week of November that ETH finally dropped. Okay, so when you look at it this time, what do you notice by ETH? It's not getting to the 20-week SMA just like it wasn't in 2019, right? Every single move up is just a rejection by the 21-week EMA. It doesn't even have the strength to get to the 20-week SMA, and this is exactly what happened in 2019 just before Ethereum capitulated in mid-November, in the second week of November. And so I don't apologize for my views. I admit I could be wrong, and that's why I think it makes sense to hedge and also look at other people's views to see if maybe I'm missing something, which there's a chance that I am. But one of the things to consider with the monetary policy view and why comparing to 2019 can make a lot of sense. If you look at the year-to-date ROI of ETH against Bitcoin, there's only 1 year where it really looks like this. Maybe there's 2, but if you look at 2024, ETH Bitcoin in 2024, does it look like 2021 at all? No. Does it look like 2022 at all? No, not really. Does it look like 2023? Kind of. Yeah. Because monetary policy was tightening up in 2023, just like 2024. But it also looks like another year, 2019, where ETH Bitcoin dropped into those rate cuts. So I would argue that the comparison is valid. And maybe also 2016 has some similarities, but the reason it's not as obvious is because at the very beginning of 2016, ETH Bitcoin had a massive rally. And so while the rest of it is really similar because that rally happened at the very beginning, it sort of distorts everything else. But if you can imagine, if you shifted the year-to-date ROI just over like 50 days or something, it would actually look very similar to 2019. It's just that this rally happened at the very beginning of the year. So I think that monetary policy is important. I think that interest rates have played a big role in this cycle. I think that quantitative tightening has played a big role in this cycle. And I do think that there is a decent chance that Ethereum is headed home. And if it happens, which is a big if, but if it happens, it's what it always does. Okay? It's what it's done in 2015 and in 2016. And this was Q4. Right? It was Q4 of 2015. So you had Q4 of 2015, home. You have Q4 of 2016, home. You've got Q4 of 2019. Why not Q4 2024? Let's see. It's going to happen soon enough if it's going to happen. And if it doesn't, then hopefully there's a reason to pivot. My guess is if there is a reason to pivot, it'll be shown in the chart. If you see a weekly close by ETH above the 20-week SMA, then perhaps I'm wrong. But as long as it's below the 21-week EMA on weekly closes, then I still think this is the most likely outcome. So hopefully in about 1 to 2 months, I can welcome Ethereum home. If not, then I suppose it will, of course, be a failed theory. Some of those happen. That's okay. But I just want to put those thoughts out there. And there you have it. More information is I think, hopefully helpful. And we'll see what happens. But if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.